All right, welcome everybody. My name is Everett DePangher, and I'm the facilitator here in the Deeper Questions discussion series. It's good to see a couple new faces. Thanks very much for coming. Today we're going to, the topic for today is Scriptural Origins, from where do holy texts come, which is the second of a two-part discussion that we've had on Scripture. And just to give everyone sort of a plan for where we're going from here, we're going to spend the first half on the group exercise, then we're going to have the second half be on just a general discussion on Scripture and issues relating to it, and I don't have a whole lot to bring to that. I want people, now that we've been focusing on the issue for a little while, I want everyone to raise whatever issues they want to discuss from whatever perspective you come from on the issues we'll be talking about. So that'll be a fairly open portion of the conversation. I've distributed the handout for discussion 4, and I want to talk for a minute about that, and I'll mention it again at the end. Discussion 4, since it falls right in the middle of the 7, and it's going to be sort of a special format for a couple of reasons. One is we've been moved down the hallway to room 506. And that's just a logistical thing because we couldn't reserve this room. But also, that discussion is going to be the most technical of all of the discussions. And I know some people are more interested in the theological, philosophical issues, and some are more interested in the textual studies and the history issues. And of course, those are all interrelated a whole lot. But that one will be fully textual and history. It'll be just a walkthrough in some more detail on how to address some of the more specific issues that we've been dealing with last week and this week. So if that's not your thing, don't worry about it too much. Back on discussion 5, we'll sort of pick up, and we'll incorporate some of the material from discussion 4, but just so everyone knows, that will be a more technical conversation. And then after that, in 5 and 6, we'll move into a 2-part on miracles, and then in 7, we'll have the second 2-part on coexistence, but we had the first and the last on coexistence because I wanted that issue to bracket the rest of the conversations. Any thoughts or questions about that? All right. So I want to jump into the group exercise. And unfortunately, I found a professional reader for the text last time. I didn't for this time. So I'm just going to read this into the record here. One other thing. We are recording this session because since this is a pilot project, I'm putting this up on YouTube. It's audio only, but I'm putting it up on YouTube for future use and so forth. So I'm going to just read this into the record for our YouTube viewing friends, and I'll try and inflect as best as I can to kind of bring out the points of emphasis. As with last time, we're going into this without me saying anything about the text. We're just looking at the text and then going to explore it from there. I do later on in my report section on the handout. I do have a bunch of information. So for those of you who looked at that, there are a lot of answers already in there. But for the discussion, we're just going to embark just straight into the text. All right. So this is dense, and I understand that. So for the next 3 or 4 minutes, just sort of bear through this, and then we'll understand why this is important shortly. At which, nevertheless, he was present, and so he placed it in his narrative. The third book of the Gospel is that according to Luke. Luke, the well-known physician, wrote it in his own name, according to the general belief after the ascension of Christ, when Paul was associated him with himself as one zealous for correctness, one who took pains to find out the facts. It is true that he had not seen the Lord in the flesh, Yet having ascertained the facts, he was able to begin his narrative with the nativity of John. The fourth book of the Gospel is that of John, one of the disciples. In response to the exhortation of his fellow disciples and bishops, he said, "Fast with me for 3 days, and then let us tell each other whatever shall be revealed to each one." The same night, it was revealed to Andrew, who was one of the apostles, that it was John who should relate in his own name what they collectively remembered, or that John should relate in his own name, they all acting as correctors. And so to the faith of believers there is no discord, even although different selections are given from the facts to the individual books of the Gospels, because in all of them, under one guiding spirit, all things relative to his nativity, passion, resurrection, conversation with his disciples, and his twofold advent, the first in humiliation rising from contempt, which took place, and the second in the glory of kingly power, which is yet to come, have been declared. What marvel it is that if John induces so consistently in his epistles these several things, saying in person, "What we have seen with our eyes and heard with our ears and our hands have handled, these things we have written." Those things we have written. For thus he professes to be not only an eyewitness, but also a hearer and a narrator of all the wonderful things of the Lord in their order. Moreover, the Acts of all the apostles are written in one book. Luke so comprised them for the most excellent Theophilus, because of the individual events that took place in his presence, as he clearly shows by omitting the passion of Peter, as well as the departure of Paul, when Paul went from the city of Rome to Spain. Now, the epistles of Paul, what they are and for what reason they were sent, they themselves make clear to him who will understand. First of all, he wrote at length to the Corinthians to prohibit the system of heresy, then to the Galatians against circumcision, and to the Romans on the order of Scriptures, initiating also that Christ is the chief matter in them. Each of which is necessary for us to discuss, seeing that the blessed Apostle Paul himself, following the example of his predecessor John, writes to no more than 7 churches by name in the following order: Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Galatians, Thessalonians, and Romans. But he writes twice for the sake of correction to the Corinthians and to the Thessalonians. That there is one church diffused throughout the whole earth is shown by the sevenfold writing and John also in the Apocalypse. Even though he writes to the 7 churches, he speaks to all. But he wrote out of affection and love, one to Philemon, one to Titus, 2 to Timothy, and these are held sacred in the honorable esteem of the Church Universal in the regulation of ecclesiastical discipline. There are adduced one to the Laodiceans, another to the Alexandrians, forged in the name of Paul against the heresy of Marcion, and many others which can't be received into the Church Universal, for it is not fitting that gall be mixed with honey. Further, an epistle of Jude and 2 bearing the name of John are counted among the general epistles, and wisdom written by the friends of Solomon in his honor. We receive the apocalypses of John and Peter only. Some of us do not wish the Apocalypse of Peter to be read in church. But Hermas wrote the shepherd in the city of Rome most recently in our times, when his brother Bishop Pius was occupying the chair in the church at Rome. And so indeed it ought to be read, but that it be made public to the people in the church and placed among the prophets whose number is complete, or among the apostles, is not possible to the end of time. We reject everything written by Arsenus, Valentinus, and Miltiades. We also reject those who wrote the new book of Psalms, Marcion, together with Balsiades, and the Asian Cataphrygians. All right, so what was that all about?
It sounds to me like what's the word? Well, it's like they're trying to decide what to consider, what should be added to the canon or should be scripture.
Right. So it's a decision. It's a decision-making document.
It's one side's off someone the head.
Yeah, who wrote this? And for what's the context of this being written? Who wrote it? Who's it for? Those sorts of questions. Also, there's something about the document itself that sort of stands out.
Well, I see the word "we" quite a bit, so there's probably more than one author.
Okay, so this is
more than one person who contributed to it.
Right. It's a group. This is a statement on behalf of a group. Yeah. I did not redact this document, so the beginning is the beginning. This is a fragmentary text, meaning it physically only survives in part. It was just in the course of history was partially destroyed, at least at the beginning. And this translator that I used puts an ellipsis at the end as well. It is an ending point. It is an end of a sentence, but this translator is viewing this as possibly a fragmentation at the end as well. Who's the audience? Who's the audience? Who's the intent? Who's the recipient of this? I'm going over some of the general questions we went through last time. Well, there aren't as many that we need to do, but a few of the major ones I want to touch on.
Well, I thought it was some sort of decision-making body. So they're trying to convince someone else of what they find appropriate for.
Right. So are you saying it's a persuasive text? Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts? This is, and any scholar who looks at this is going to be speculating as much as we are. They don't have any magic cards up their sleeves. But one way of looking at this is that there's a church. There's Church A and Church B. Maybe they're geographically apart to some extent. And Church A has decided what its scripture is going to be. And it's offering advice, maybe solicited, maybe unsolicited, to Church B because they're in a process of making that decision, and so they're looking at what this other church has done. Or it could also be an internal document just within Church A. It's recording its own internal. Yeah, it's just a record of its own position on what its scripture is going to be. And what is that process called? As a verb. It came out as a noun a few minutes ago.
Canonization?
Yeah, exactly. That's the process. This process is called canonization. Canon means an official list. It has different usages in English. Most often, it's used as when a house of worship or a group of houses of worship or religion decide what their scripture is going to be. They create a canon of that scripture, and then the verb is canonization. So we're looking at a canonization process here. And let me take a few minutes to just step way back and put this in context, and then we'll go into the text itself. When we left off last time, or when we did the group exercise last time, we focused on the letter of the elder, this document that I said would later be known as 3rd John. And at that point, we were looking at a period of time in which that sort of document was typical, in that there were just a lot of documents being exchanged in the early Christian movement. You could call them the early Christians, or the group that would emerge as what would be known as Christianity later down the line, depending on how you want to put it. But at that time, there was just a lot of documents going back and forth, a lot of correspondence, a lot of correspondence and a lot of other genre of writings. We looked at an Apocalypse. There are Gospels, which we won't really be looking at, but a lot of documents going back and forth. And then the text that's today called 2 Peter gets in the mix with all that. And what's the significance of 2 Peter? Well, 2 Peter ends with, it's a document. Just like 3 John, there's a conversation going on about what association John has with 3 John. There's a conversation going on about what relationship Peter has with this text that's called 2 Peter. But that doesn't matter so much right now. What matters is that the author wrote this text, it's going along, and at the end, or very near the end, he makes the following passing comment. He says, this is sort of mid-sentence, he's been saying some other stuff. Just as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given him, wrote to you, as also in all his letters, speaking to them of these things, in which are some things hard to understand, which the untaught and unstable distort, as they do also the rest of the Scriptures to their own destruction. So that translator wanted to bring that all into one big English sentence. But what's the significance of that statement? Well, when it refers to the Scriptures, what is it talking about? It's probably talking about the Jewish Scriptures, which would be the dominant would be the dominant canon, or at least the dominant body of Scriptures in the context in which this person is writing. And so, as I talk, I sort of I try and say in the handout a little bit about how basically if one is in an environment in which there is a dominant body of Scripture, and you see a document that says the Scriptures, it's probably going to be a reference to that dominant body of Scripture. But that being said, what else is going on here?
I get a sense of mild rebuke, or at least questioning of Paul's wisdom, sort of obliquely.
That's interesting.
I'm not sure.
But certainly it's a criticism of the untaught and the unstable, yeah. Right?
Well, it seems to, at least in this translation, seems to sort of infer that Paul might be one of those.
Well, it refers to the wisdom given.
That seems... there's a Monty Python sketch. Of course, wonderfully British. Forget how it goes, but this... One asks the other, what do you do when you're trying to, when you're running against another politician? His protege says, well, rubbish him. You start slinging some mud. And the teacher goes on and says, no, the first thing you do is you profess unswerving support. Because you must get firmly behind them before you can stab them in the back. And that seems to be kind of what's going on here.
Huh.
Why he would say,
that's interesting.
According to the wisdom given him, I'm reading a lot into it.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. What is the relationship between... He refers to the Scriptures. Why are the Scriptures brought into this conversation?
It kind of makes a more general comment about the way these people are using these texts in the wrong way.
Right. Yeah, the untaught and the unstable, they don't understand the Scriptures, and so they're not going to understand Paul's correspondence either. The point, and there's a lot of various types of important things. Yeah.
I sort of get the idea that Paul might be trying to, or at least from the perspective of the writer, is maybe trying to amend or add to the Scriptures.
Yeah.
In some fashion.
Yeah, that's
warning against that.
Well, that's where I'm going. It's the operative word here for our purposes. I mean, and this is part of a much bigger document that has all sorts of other important issues in it. The important thing for our purposes is the word rest, or the rest. This is the only time, or not the only time. It's either the first time or one of the first times ever in any of these documents that are floating around where you see other correspondence referred to as the rest of the Scriptures. This is a hugely significant point in the formation of any religion. It's saying there are the Scriptures, but hey, what we're doing now, and these documents that we now have, in this case, the writings of Paul, are now, we're going to make them Scripture as well. It's a fundamentally significant point in the formation of a religion. It is becoming a canonical religion. It's becoming a religion with Scripture. It's becoming a religion with its own Scripture. It's either the first or one of the first times that this in surviving documents has ever been said. But notice that there's not a whole lot said here. This author is recognizing some sort of a canonization. There is the writings of Paul are canonical. It doesn't say what those writings are or how many there are or whether there's additional addition to the Scriptures that they're recognizing. It's a very passing comment at the very end of the letter, but it's the first time you see this. Now let's fast forward about, well, I won't say how much we fast forward, but let's fast forward to the year 367 CE. And what's significant about the year 367 CE?
BC?
CE.
Oh, that was about when the Roman Church was that the Council of Nicene, or was that more like 392? It's when they started putting together the canon. The Council of Nicaea is, don't quote me on this, I think it's 325 CE. From which comes the central statement of the beliefs of Christianity, the Nicene Creed. But in 367, a man named Athanasius, who spent some time in modern-day Egypt, wrote a document called the 39th Festal Letter, in which he proposes a canon within the Christian religion that contains, there are two parts of it. One is he discusses the Jewish Scriptures and his position on what they should be. But then the second part, he says, for the uniquely Christian portion of the canon, he proposes 27 documents. And those documents are what? Or would become what? Yeah. Later on, after 367, as different canons are being discussed, from this point, from the point of 2 Peter onward, you see various canons proposed and discussed. it is in 367 in the first surviving writing that he says that his position is, writing on behalf of him and his church, that these 27 texts should be the canon. And then later down the road, that option emerges as basically the consensus choice, and then that goes on to become the prominent body of documents that's known as the New Testament today. So, to put everything in some context here, I've made a little timeline here, and I tried to get it all to scale. I think I got it pretty close. So there's the crucifixion. It occurred right around 30 CE. Here is today, 2012 CE. Here is for the text we looked at last time, 3 John. It's most scholars I've seen will date it somewhere within 70 to 120 CE. So there might be someone who would put it a little later. There might be someone who would put it a little earlier, but that's sort of the range. That gray area right there is the date range for that. For the text we just looked at, are there any thoughts on when it was written? There's one big clue and one little clue.
He refers to Hermas, who wrote the shepherd of the city of Rome, most recently in our times.
Yes, that's...
occupying the chair in the church of Rome.
Yeah, that's... Yeah.
Smart enough in my history, I could discern when that was.
Yep, that's exactly it. That's the little clue. It's that individual Pius who's mentioned is someone who when he was occupying the chair in the church at Rome. By the way, what does that mean? Yeah, what Roman Catholics would refer to as he was the Pope during that period of time. Within some range, you can estimate when that was, when the tenure of Pius was, and then there's another big clue. It may be, you guys might not be saying it because it's so obvious. What has to happen before this text is written?
Well, there has to be Rome.
That's true. That's true.
That's the most obvious thing.
I'll just say it. It's sort of. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
The establishment of the church. See, the church in. Well, go ahead.
Well, actually, that's a good point. It's to the extent that there are clues in here about the level of organization that's been attained. That is a clue, and depending on how much you can glean from that, it can be a big clue. The real big clue, I'll just say, is that all the texts that are mentioned in the document and all the people mentioned in the document have to have already been written or had their careers. Sort of an obvious thing, but once in a while, someone will sort of miss that point to their own detriment. So based on all that, and specifically on the Pius, this occurring in the aftermath of the tenure of Pius, would put this here, 170 to 200 CE. This text is called the Muratorian Canon, and it's called that because a guy named Muratori first discovered and published it in the 18th century. It's unusual for these texts. Generally, these texts are, if they're labeled something, they're labeled either after their purported author or their purported recipient. This one's just unusual. It's the historian that discovered it is the name. So that's the date range right there. Some people will say 170 to 200. There's a minority view that interprets the word recently. It says in the city of Rome, most recently in our times, as being a much more expansive word. than this date range would put it, and so would say it may even be as late as, say, 350 to 400, something like that. But there's a school of thought, the one I bump into the most, we'll put it in the 170 to 200 range. And then here is the 39th Feastal Letter. So when we're talking about Scripture formation, we see that the Muratorian canon is bracketed on both sides, on the one side by the texts themselves, and on the other side by the later, what would the first proposal, or the first surviving written proposal of what would be called the New Testament. So this period in between is an important period because that was when the decisions were being made that led up to what would today be the New Testament, and basically the most along with the Old Testament or the Jewish, the Hebrew Bible, the most important, most widely read canon in the history of the world. So the Muratorian canon is one of the best preserved specimens of that process that we have. It's the most, just notwithstanding the fact that the beginning has been chopped off. It's one of the most systematic statements and discussions of that process that we have access to, which means basically we are right now having the closest to one of the closest to a front row seats at the formation of what would ultimately be the Bible, as you could pretty much have. So all those people who paid $9.95 to go watch a Dan Brown movie about Tom Hanks making the Bible or whatever that was, could have saved their $9.95 and just read this. So with that in mind, we're going to explore for a little bit how the Bible was made by someone who was there and who was a decision maker in the process. It was a long process. That even though it takes up a little piece of the window right there, that's longer than all of American history right there. So it's a long period of time, and it was a huge geographic area. These were conversations and discussions being made in different locations spread across the Roman Empire, which was a large political entity that more or less surrounded the bulk of the Mediterranean Sea. Any thoughts so far before we go into some of the specifics? We're good? All right. I want to bring out a few different particular parts to delve into this individual, and it appears that he is talking on behalf of his church community, so the thought process that goes into his church community. This section here, which is it's the first full surviving paragraph, talks a lot about Luke, and talks a lot about his relationship with Paul, and why is that? Why spend a paragraph on the relationship between Luke and Paul and things that happened with that? Well, let me ask a larger question first. There are, if you look to page 20, there's a comparison. I made a comparison chart that compares the Muratorian canon and the New Testament canon, just so that people can have a side-by-side reference. For the Muratorian canon, and notice the distinct overlap. The two canons are similar. They basically they cover 29 documents in total. They agree on 23. They disagree on 6. what are some things that stand out about what the Muratorian canon texts, what stands out about them in terms of their common qualities that may have reference to this paragraph here? Well, let me draw your attention specifically to, and for those of you who aren't familiar with some of the nuances of these texts, I apologize, because in asking this question, I do sort of draw on some of the background information. But in the Muratorian canon, there are 4 texts that are different. Those would be Luke, the Acts of the Apostles, the Book of Wisdom, and maybe Jude. What stands out about those 4? Actually, set aside Jude for the moment. Book of Wisdom, Luke, and actually let's throw in Mark, Luke. Any thoughts? Well, I'll just say the large majority of these texts purport in the Muratorian canon to have an apostolic author. That the Muratorian canon in the big bulk of the cases says an apostle was the author of this text. In the large majority of the cases. And just to define an apostle briefly, it's basically someone who, there are different definitions, I suppose, floating around, but for all purposes, it's someone who was understood as having seen Jesus alive after he had died and was called to lead the organization of the church. The large majority of the cases, those people are considered the author here. And notice the many references to John, son of Zebedee. It's pretty much every reference to John, except for the first one where it talks about the nativity of John in Luke. That's John the Baptist. But the remainder, those are references to John, son of Zebedee, our friend from last time around. And John, what are some thoughts on the role that John is playing in this text? The whole text overall. He plays this sort of, in this big paragraph here on the top, he plays this sort of explosive role where he's gathering. Actually, let me just skip to that section. Do I have it? No, sorry, it's just in the handout. Here, this big paragraph where he's talking. There's this long discussion about how John has been called, along with this gathering of the disciples and bishops, along with Andrew, to write what is the 4th gospel, or the gospel it's called today the Gospel of John. It's this, and for reasons that I put in a footnote here in footnote 21, I go into this in more detail, but it appears that there are 5 different texts. Well, there are at least 4 different texts that are associated with John, son of Zebedee here. John, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. Which means that by this point we have already, and it's sprinkled throughout, this concept of the Johannine writings, which we talked about last time. This idea that there's this body of writings associated with John. And even though we know that the stated author of 3 John is who? It's the elder. It's an anonymous person. It could be John, son of Zebedee. It may not be. But it's this sense that you get throughout the text that these various documents, and we haven't looked at 1 John, we haven't looked at 2 John, and we'd have to look at them in some detail to fully understand the significance. But having looked in some detail at 3 John, we see this convergence of documents, even those not bearing his name, even though the text says here, explicitly at one point it refers to two bearing the name of John. Those are probably 2 John and 3 John. Even though they don't actually bear his name, there's this convergence now, by this point in history, of documents associated with John, son of Zebedee, who, as we discussed last time, was someone who was close to Jesus and was, by this point, clearly viewed as an apostle. And there's this very dramatic discussion about God's revealing stuff to him, and there's been a revelation to Andrew that there's going to be a revelation through these people to John. It's this big, explosive, cosmic role that John, son of Zebedee, is assuming. So just for those of you who are at the last discussion, contrast that depiction with the text that we discussed last time, and see the role that text is now assuming here. Returning, so after that detour, Luke is one of the very few people who this text is saying, hey, this was, we're saying the author, even for many of these texts are anonymous, but we're saying the author was this person. In this case, we're saying the author was Luke. But it says Luke was not an apostle. Well, it says it is true that he had not seen the Lord in the flesh.
Yeah, I was going to say that it seems like somebody's vouching for someone. You can't really figure out who. Either Luke is vouching for Paul or Paul is vouching for Luke. But,
right.
Like say, Paul is saying that he's someone who values correctness, so we should take him seriously.
Right. The thrust of this is that Paul, who is clearly viewed in this text as an apostle, and viewed him, and if we looked a little bit at his writings, and we'll look at them again in discussion 6, he clearly viewed himself as an apostle. And this text is perfectly happy to recognize him as such. Is saying Luke's okay because he got all his stuff through Paul. So there's this one step removed. The text is saying one step removed is okay. And we see this in all the texts except the book of wisdom. It's an apostle or it's someone one step removed from an apostle. And John Mark, or Mark as he's more commonly called, who gets associated with the second gospel, as Luke gets associated with the third, you'll see in other texts there is this sense as well. He's depicted in some other texts that are floating around during this time as someone who's associated with Simon Peter, who's also a major apostle. So that's the big headline overarching this whole text is we canonize apostolic texts, and then once in a while we'll throw in a one step removed. But we had this whole paragraph about how that one step removed is a really tiny step, and he was being carefully watched by Paul the whole way. So that's significant for them.
I'm
Yeah.
curious, how many of the apostles were disciples, actual followers of Christ?
That's a
In
big.
short, how many of the apostles actually met him before the resurrection?
Yeah, that's a big. Thanks for coming. That's a big question.
The $1 million question.
That's a tough one to give a short answer to. We know
Well,
the apostle we know by far the most about is Paul,
Oh, of course.
who didn't know
Which I find,
who didn't know Jesus.
I mean, it's a bit of a tangent from what we're talking about, but I find that very telling. Of course, Paul is going to say he's an authority.
Mm-hmm.
it's just curious to me the entire structure of this. I don't want to say Christianity as a whole, but pretty much rests on the word of Paul. That someone who never actually met Jesus says that he saw Jesus after the resurrection. I know that's not what we're going
No, that's perfectly valid point to bring up at this point. Yeah.
A very flimsy premise for such a thing. I mean, there's a quote. I never can remember who says it. It's been attributed to a lot of people. Which is more likely that nature would leave her course, or that a man would lie, or make a mistake? It's the fact that Paul never actually met Jesus, and yet that's where the entire religion rests on the resurrection, that Jesus rose after 3 days, but we only have Paul's word for that. Okay, tangent.
Right. No, that's perfect. That's perfectly good. It's it's definitely true. Paul plays a very, very central role here.
The resurrection is mentioned in other gospels.
I'm not a scholar.
I just mean it's not just mentioned by Paul, but Paul is the one. If you took him out of the mix, you wouldn't have near the instructions to the churches, which is, as far as how the churches are run and what the rules are and all that. That all comes from Paul's letter.
Honestly, me being the diehard cynic that I am, I'm thinking that Paul, going on, so, hey, this might work. Hey, I saw Jesus, everybody. Listen to me. But that's...
Yeah, and Paul was an interest, from what... I can't quote anything authoritatively, but he was a very, very zealous, odd, full of himself person.
He got a chance to grab power.
Well, he was just...
Authority.
Maybe one way to say it, but he was also, he persecuted Christians with all this zeal, and then he had the road to Damascus or whatever it was. But then all of a sudden he becomes just as zealous in the other way. He's a very possessed kind of person.
It just seems like a poor foundation, in my humble opinion.
But he had a good reputation.
Well, sure he did.
I don't know, that makes a difference.
We're going to be looking at Paul. The miracle we're going to be talking about in discussion 6 is...
I'm sure he would be the first to tell you that he had a great reputation.
is Paul. We'll be focusing on... He's going to describe in one of his... Actually, on a couple occasions, but we'll look at one. He's going to describe sort of... He lays out in his letter to Galatia all the evidence. He's having a fight with some of the other apostles, and he lays out all the evidence for why this experience has happened to him too. So we'll be exploring that in a lot of detail. It's a really interesting miracle to look at. Other thoughts on that? I don't want to hinder the conversation there, because that was good. All right, let's move on to this, and we've already discussed this in some depth in terms of the association of the Shepherd of Hermas with this. It's basically saying that the Shepherd of Hermas is not acceptable because it's late. It was written late. It was written most recently in our own times. And the Shepherd of Hermas is an interesting document. It was a very important. It's not a document I know tons and tons about. I couldn't quote it chapter and verse to you, but it's a very important early Christian document. It was in the running it was viewed as, it was essentially canonized in some places. It was a strong candidate for canonization. Even as far out, and in the 39th Festal letter, Athanasius, even when he does his 27 text, but says, hey, there are some other really important documents too, and the Shepherd of Hermas is one of them. But the objection here is what? It's late. It's recent, which means it's not apostolic.
I find that last sentence curious, and so indeed it ought to be read, but that it be made public to the people in the church and placed among the prophets, whose number is complete, or among the apostles is not possible to do. Okay, I answered my own question.
Okay.
I was thinking that it was saying that we should read it, but it shouldn't be allowed to be seen by the general public. But then I read it should be read, but not as canon.
Right.
It's not worthy of being placed among the works of the prophets and apostles.
Right. Exactly. And you'll see, and this is true in canonization processes in general, that you don't necessarily, when there's a canonization, have to have one stratum. You can have multiple stratum. And this may be something similar to that. That it's saying, here's the top, but we'll sub-canonize some texts. And so it's saying, we have a lot of respect for this text, so read it. And it may be that this author is aware that it's been canonized elsewhere. So it's saying, all right, yeah, we do like it, but we're just not going to. Mm-hmm.
It's great that you guys like it, but we're not so keen.
Right. Here's an interesting little bit. We don't have to go on this too much. It's sort of an obvious point, but it says, we receive the apocalypses of John and Peter only. And we looked briefly at the opening of the Apocalypse of John, and it's today is what's often called the Book of Revelation. Then it goes on to say, some of us do not wish the Apocalypse of Peter to be read in church. Which is interesting. It's the only point in the whole text where they say, our community is divided on this. They put in a dissenting. So, which may mean that they were in general consensus on all their decision, or most of their decisions. But on this one, it was close enough so that they just wanted to register kind of a dissenting position.
I lost my thought.
That's okay.
Go ahead, it's gone.
All right.
I'll wake up later tonight.
All right. Feel free to get more food and stuff as well if people are a little famished here at the end of the day. There is plenty. All right. Yeah. That's the slide I was fishing for earlier. That's the John discussion. Let's skip that one. And, okay. This one's really interesting. There's a line in here. It's after the section of the discussion of the letters of Paul. It says, there are adduced one to the Laodiceans, another to the Alexandrians, forged in the name of Paul against the heresy of Marcion.
Another what?
Huh?
Oh, I'm sorry. The word order on these is weird.
It is that I think
confusing.
The original in the original language. I think what's going on. This is a Latin text. I think there are some really long sentences, and so this translator is trying to preserve that in ways that you wouldn't normally see in contemporary English, at least. Marcion, for those who don't know, was a fairly significant theologian in the early 2nd century who had some very distinct views about some things that what he believed doesn't really matter too much here. But this community disagrees with his followers. And they make that...
It seems to be saying they sent out... I don't know. They're trying to get their message out before this guy's message takes hold.
Well, what the reduced one, and the grammar here isn't really great, but there's a letter, they have in their possession a letter to Laodicea and a letter to Alexandria. And
it sounds like it's a precaution, or
well, who are they saying wrote them?
the letters?
Yeah.
It doesn't say.
Forged.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
fortunately. Oh,
Yeah. So it purports to be Paul's letter to Laodicea and Paul's letter to Alexandria. And they have these documents. And they're saying, and they're rejecting them. They're saying we're aware of these texts. We're not going to canonize them. And what's the ground for doing so?
well, heresy.
Well,
The grounds for not
it's
canonizing
well, who's the heretic here?
Marcion.
Right.
Paul apparently doesn't like him.
Is it Paul?
Well, whoever wrote
Right.
the letters in the name of Paul.
Well, what we're seeing here is what we're seeing here, and we're going to look at this a lot more next time, is they have a document. It has someone. It purports to be something. It purports to be a letter of Paul to Laodicea and Alexandria. What they're saying is that you have, and chronologically, you have Paul, he dies. You have Marcion, has his career. And there's no question, in the background of this, maybe I should have said this explicitly, Marcion lived after Paul. That's not even an issue. That Paul would...
Did they overlap at all? Or was it considerably after?
Yeah, but I think Marcion's public career was in the early 2nd century-ish.
So, long time
and
after.
Paul most likely
well
died in
and
60s
truly
CE.
dead.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That makes things a lot.
Sorry, I probably should have said that explicitly.
Well, if Paul was dead, Paul can't write a letter to anyone about Marcion.
Right.
Unless, of course, he indeed was a prophet. That would be pretty good by those standards.
Yeah, so it's saying, and notice this hits all the criteria. It fails to hit all the criteria. It's not apostolic. It's really late because it's post-Marcion, reflecting back on his career negatively.
And yet it's still considered canon.
Well, it's not.
Oh, it's not.
This is in the portion, toward the end they have this portion where they list all the stuff that they were rejecting.
I see.
And so that's, in there. But the content, and this is the interesting part. Well, there's more, that hopefully it's all interesting, but do they agree or disagree with the contents of the letter to Laodicea and the letter to Alexandria?
I don't see any opinion.
Well, it's written against Marcion. They disagree with Marcion.
Well, yeah, the language does seem to suggest that at least they accept that it's heresy.
So what they're saying is, at least in general terms, we agree with the contents of these texts. It's criticizing Marcion. We're criticizing Marcion. But for all these reasons, it fails to hit all the criteria. So even though we agree with it, at least in general terms, there may be some parts of it that they would disagree with or so forth, but we are rejecting it because it hits. So that, then the point of that little exercise of going through that sentence is to say that agreement is not a dispositive criterion. It's just because they pick up a text and say, wow, this is a great text, we agree with it, which appears to be going on in this case, they still reject it for these other grounds. All right, so I think those are all the sections I want to kind of to bring people's attention to. And again, this is, there's a lot that people talk about the Bible. There's a lot of people get excited about the Bible being people get worked up about the Bible, but it's what you guys have just seen is a front row seat through the eyes of someone, an anonymous person who's long forgotten, but nonetheless a real person who is actually there and was involved in the process. So and I think it's an invaluable to have that seat in the canon formation to watch is a very invaluable process, and that's why I love studying and teaching this particular text. So with that, hopefully that kind of got some thoughts going. Let's turn to the general discussion about Scripture and holy texts and their role. And I mean, it can be personal, it can be not personal. You can talk about it in terms of your life. You can talk about influence on society. I'm more than happy for us to bring up different scriptures than the New Testament, which we've been focusing on, because just for the sake of having a case study, I wanted to focus on one, but obviously there's an awful lot of scripture out there. What do people want to talk about in general?
I want to talk about, so the authors of this,
Mm-hmm.
who are they again?
Of
this text here.
Of the Muratorian
Yeah,
canon?
who are these people who are discussing the Bible?
It's a church. Somewhere in, it would be a church in a city, possibly writing to a church in another city, and they're forgotten. They're forgotten to history other than this.
Apparently they lost at some point because the New Testament became dominant.
Right.
The New Testament became dominant rather than marriage.
Yeah, eventually some...
This is the losing side.
Well, I will say...
More or less.
There's a famous... have people heard of Nag Hammadi? Nag Hammadi is a significant archaeological... is a significant archaeological discovery for Christianity in the last... It's a significant 20th century archaeological discovery for Christianity, and they unearthed a library that appears to have been a library, so all the documents that some community of people owned out of the deserts of Egypt. And I think the overlap between the New Testament and that, to the extent that the texts in that library constitute a canon, I think there was zero overlap. So the Muratorian canon and the New Testament are very similar, and they agree in 23 out of 29 times. So there is quite a bit of overlap. But right, so their views on certain parts of this didn't carry the day. So, Ms. Stephan, did that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, I guess so. I was mostly asking the question, like who are they to, these big decisions with what's their authority? I'm assuming they have access to some really good and juicy information, like that other people don't. It'd be like if I own a library with some special books, I can put them together and create this review or something. So is this church, do they have connections with these apostles?
The only thing we know about them is this. That's the whole thing. Yeah. Now we do know. I'll say there was not a period of time. I think there may be a false impression that half floats around in there that in the trajectory of Christian documents, there wasn't a period of time where everything got lost and then got rediscovered. These texts were all there all along. I mean, things get lost all the time and things get discovered all the time. But they apparently had all of these documents, or at least knew people, or at least at least someone in their community had reviewed all of these documents, and they'd been floating around. Sorry, is that kind of answer? It's not a. That's one of the things that's really interesting about this person who wrote this, is he's just like many other people, just like possibly the elder last time, is just sort of a person who's now dissipated into the past, and we have this little snapshot into their life.
That always makes me wonder what will survive me, say, 2,000 years from now.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting question. Yeah.
The odds are that there will be nothing. But it would be curious to know what little fragment of my life might show up, like an email to my mother or whatnot, and everybody's scholars obsessing over who was this guy.
Yeah.
Although I go off on that changing, I doubt that kind of thing will happen. I doubt we will have the same fragmentation of information going into the future simply because it's so easy to store data for long periods of time. Unless something massive happens.
Right.
Like sun goes over. Sorry, that's really way off.
The data for long periods of time, it does have to be maintained by people. And one really interesting thing about books, they've turned out to be a lot more stable than they thought. But there are times in the past.
I'm talking more about redundancy.
Okay, literally a flow of information to people.
And information is duplicated so many times that it's going to be saved some. The odds are much better now that whatever will be passed. Or just completely lost.
So one exercise that I think is helpful is just think of the last thing you wrote. And then what is that? Just whatever it was. It could be a shopping list. It could be a Facebook post. It could be something on a napkin. And what if that was the only thing about you that survived? And then what impression would the person have of you, just based on whatever that random thing is, the last physical thing that you produced?
The last thing I wrote was a Facebook post last night. When does the narwhal bacon?
There you go.
That was it.
Maybe they'll know one day.
And none of you are regulars.
Yeah, is it?
You didn't get it?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm not completely alone.
Other thoughts?
So I guess I wonder, why does one canon survive while the other doesn't? I mean, this one didn't, right?
Well, it gets.
The actual canon survive?
There it is.
The canon. But then also, as best as we know, none of the other ones at that time period did.
It survived better than most.
But in terms of it, I mean, not just the physical document, but the following of that canon. Yes, as far as we know, if let's say this was written in about 180 CE, within the Christian religion, there's not a single canon that survives. Now, I mean, there are a lot of them are very similar to each other, right? You can't go down to the bookstore and purchase the Muratorian canon. I mean, you can purchase this, but you can't. No one publishes the collection of texts that constitute the Muratorian canon and publish them. Any other thoughts? What are some thoughts about just the role of holy texts in general? We've kind of gotten into the nooks and crannies of one body of holy text. What role do they have in society? What's their significance? Anything?
Go for it.
My main thought is not really about what their effect on society, but more of what causes us to fixate on Scripture. What makes it so important? Because if you think back to these times when these things were written, the act of writing was a very mystical kind of thing. It sort of seemed to give anybody who could read and write was automatically seen as something like they had some mystical understanding, because the only recently have we had any kind of common literacy.
Mm-hmm.
So the written word was unknown. It was not understood,
rare,
therefore was given a great deal of power in the common mind. And I think that's kind of why we still put so much stock in the written word, even though it's inordinately common now. That's why every now and then you'll still hear someone say, but it's written like that's something significant.
Mm-hmm.
But 1,000 years ago it was significant, because writing was such a strange, magical thing. Only the most intelligent and learned people knew how to write. Just my thought.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because to what extent, if writing is much more rare, to what extent, I'm just holding a physical document today, is just, we do that all the time, but if you're in a society where just having it in front of you is a more unusual thing, what impact does that have on all the thinking that goes into something like this?
Things we take for granted today would have been considered magic of the highest order back in these times that we're discussing. The electric light would have been unbelievably, I mean, even iron would have been just beyond their understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know, was that iron?
Well, the electric iron, certainly.
I don't know, but
Glass.
glass.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts?
The cheapest glass which is in glass at Walmart, would have been utterly priceless.
Well, that question they brought up, like why do people still hold on to it so much now? It's really interesting. Because we've gotten tons of new information since then. So why are we still holding it on something back then? One kind of hypothesis that I'm kind of thinking of is maybe right now, a lot of things in morality and the way it applies to society changes over time. And I'm thinking maybe having this book that supposedly tells you absolute morality provides some comfort among all that. A lot of us would say, hey, we really like this progressive morality. It hasn't changed. Maybe there's something we really want, the absolute.
Yeah.
I feel like it did provide comfort for the empty spaces that they couldn't fill in themselves. Just because, writing itself was great, but as far as how the world worked, they had no good understanding of that. So, and this book did apparently to them. But as we moved away from that, we realized, fighting doesn't happen just because he said so. There's natural forces at work that go on there. I think that's what just gave him so much power back then, just because it's this book explains
and they could just pretty much say whatever they want.
Right.
There was no one to call out. Mm-hmm. It says so right here. Well, perfect. Well, prove me wrong. Come up here and read it for me. Plus the fact that I lost the thought again.
That's all right.
That was really significant.
All right. Well, we can wrap this up. Unless, are there any closing comments? All right. So let me just give a brief preview for next time. Discussion 4. So again, this is the more. This will be a more technical conversation for anyone. This is mostly for people who are interested in continuing the conversation about Scripture and reading older documents and the significance that they have in conversations. If you're in a family situation where these sorts of issues about Scripture come up a lot, if you're have friends or whatever where these sorts of issues come up a lot, this will equip, regardless of one's belief, this will equip one to look at some of the more particular issues. So hopefully people who are talking don't talk past each other as much as talk to each other. So if that's something that you're interested, come on. It's March 1st. Is that right? Two Thursdays from 2 Thursdays from today, same time,
sure
but farther down the. I'm sorry.
I'm not even sure what tomorrow is.
Yeah, it's anyway. Two Thursdays from today, and that's a bit farther down the hallway. We've been moved. So with that, we shall conclude. Thank you all for coming.